The following disclaimer is for those in California only. Pursuant to California Assembly Bill 2571, it is illegal for the advertisement and or marketing of any firearm-related products and or programs in a manner that is designed, intended, or reasonably appears to be attractive to minors. As such, if you are currently in California, this program is restricted to only those that are over 18. Please turn this program off now if you are in California and under 18. Now, on to the program. Hello and welcome to the centertenspodcast. Center is a podcast that discusses small bore and precision air rifle from junior shooting sports on up to NCAA collegiate and Olympic competition. And now here's your host, Adam Pearson. Hello and welcome to this week's episode of Center Tens. This week we're going to devote pretty much the entire episode to NCAA shooting, as this is the first week where we've had a full round of matches. Had a total of 11 matches over this past weekend. So we'll go ahead and get started. Teams that shot the highest this week, we're going to hand it off to West Virginia. They had an aggregate score of 47-51 with a small bore score of 23-64 and an air rifle of 23-87. They were shooting against Akron. Their aggregate was a 46-96 with a small bore score of 23-35 and an air rifle score of 23-61. The scoring teams for West Virginia consisted of, in small bore, Mary Tucker with a 5.95, Gavin Barnick with a 5.90, Griffin Lake also had a 5.90, and Molly McGinn rounded it out with a 5.89. In air rifle, they had three shooters with 5.98s. You had Matt Sanchez, Griffin Lake, and Molly McGinn. Again, all had 5.98s, and Gavin Barnick rounded it out with a 5.93. And for Akron, small bore team was Aaron Schnupp with a 5.86, Alexis Kirk with a 5.85, Gavin Prokowski with a 5.83, and Andrew DeRoss with a 5.81. And in air rifle, Gavin Prokowski had a 5.96. We had a pair of 5.89s, had Natalia Seek and Alexis Kirk, and Andrew DeRoss rounded it out with a 5.87. The top shooters for both teams, West Virginia's top shooters, Griffin Lake and Mary Tucker, tied. They both had 11.88s. For Akron, you had Gavin Prokowski with an 11.79. Next match was Ole Miss versus Jacksonville State. They were actually shooting at Murray State. Ole Miss topped it with a 47-14, had a small bore score of 23-38 and an air rifle score of 23-76. Jacksonville State had an aggregate score of 46-75. Their small bore was a 23-13, and air rifle was a 23-62. The scoring teams for Ole Miss, Juliana Hayes had a 5.89, Leah Horvath had a 5.88, Emma Pereira with a 5.84, and Kristen Dirtling with a 5.77. And in air rifle, Leah Horvath topped it out with a 5.97. You had Kristen Dirtling with a 5.96, Emma Pereira with a 5.95, and Juliana Hayes with a 5.88. Ole Miss's top shooter was Leah Horvath with an 11.85 aggregate. For Jacksonville State, their small bore team was Lars Lillinge with a 5.85, Sam Burrow with a 5.82, Kim Jettenberg with a 5.75, and Clark McWhorter with a 5.71. And in air rifle, you had Sam Burrow with a 5.95, Lars Lillinge with a 5.92, Franz Rasmussen with a 5.89, and rounding it out was Annie Iannotti with a 5.86. And their top shooter was Sam Burrow with an 11.77. The third match was at the University of Nebraska. It was Nebraska versus Ohio State. Nebraska topped Ohio State with an aggregate of 46.98. Their small bore was a 23.21 and air rifle was 23.77. Ohio State's aggregate was a 46.84. They actually topped small bore with a 23-24, but then had a lower air rifle score with a 23-60. So that was a really close match. Scoring teams for Nebraska, their small bore team was Cecilia Ossie with a 5.85, Tori Watts with a 5.81, Emma Rode with a 5.80, and Mackenzie Strauch with a 575. In an air rifle, Cecilia Ossie had a 597, Tori Watts with a 594. Then they had a pair of 593s with Emma Rode and Charlotte Mick. The top shooter for Nebraska was Cecilia Ossie with an 1182 aggregate. In Ohio State, Victor Kiss with a 584 in small bore, Derek Kaiser with a 583, Adrian Hansen with a 579, and Paige Hollowell with a 578. And in air rifle, Victor Kiss had a 596, had a pair of 591s from Derek Kaiser and Paige Hollowell, and Dylan Gregory rounded it out with a 582. Ohio State's top shooter was Victor Kiss with an 1180 aggregate. In the third match, actually the fourth match, you had Ole Miss again versus Murray State. Ole Miss had an aggregate of 47-15. Small bore score was a 23-43, and air rifle was 23-72. Murray State had a 47-02 with a small bore score of 23-31 and an air rifle score of 23-71. The scoring teams in that match, you had Kristen Durding with a 589, Reagan Diamond with a 587, Emma Pereira with a 585, and Leah Horvath with a 582. In air rifle, Leah Horvath had a 597, Reagan Diamond with a 593, and they had a pair of 591s from Martina Gratz and Kristen Durding. Murray State's scoring teams in small bore, Scott Patterson with a 587, Matthias Kuru with a 583, John Blanton with a 582, and Paola Pravarati with a 579. And in air rifle, Scott Patterson with a 595, Alok Horder with a 593, John Blanton with a 592, and Matthias Kuru with a 591. The top shooters for both teams for Ole Miss, you had Kristen Deerding with an aggregate 1180, and Scott Patterson for Murray State had an 1182. Next matchup for that day was Georgia Southern against North Georgia. Georgia Southern topped out that match with an aggregate of 46.95, which was a new school record. They also had a new school record in both small bore and air rifle. Small bore score was a 23-18. Air rifle was a 23-77. North Georgia came in with an aggregate of 46-17. Small bore scores of 22-81. Air rifle score of 23-36. Their scoring teams for each were Georgia Southern. In small bore, you had Addie Burrow with a 588, Emma Pullman with a 586, Zahara Gonzalez Mezzo with a 572, and Amy Visconti also with a 572. In air rifle, you had Addie Burrow with a 597, Ella Golfadden with a 596, Zahara Gonzalez Mazzo with a 594, and Emma Pullman with a 590. Their top shooter was Addie Burrow with an aggregate of 1185. And for North Georgia, their scoring teams for it was small bore. You had Alyssa Walter with a 586, Maya Cameron with a 577, Alyssa Yancey with a 561, and Corbin Yockers with a 557. In air rifle, Alyssa Walter with a 593, Maya Cameron with a 590, Alyssa Yancey with a 580, and Madison Kennedy with a 573. And their top shooter was Alyssa Walter with an aggregate of 1179. The next match for the day was at Air Force Academy. It was Air Force against UTEP, which is University of Texas in El Paso. Air Force topped that match with a 47-25, a small bore score of 23-45, and an air rifle of 23-80 against UTEP's aggregate of 45-93, with a small bore of 22-59 and an air rifle of 23-34. Their scoring teams for Air Force, the small bore, was Lauren Hurley with a 590, Scott Rocket with a 586, Pinea D'Souza with a 585, and Morgan Krebs with a 584. And their air rifle team, Scott Rocket with a 599, Laura Hurley with a 598, Morgan Krebs with a 593, and Pinea D'Souza with a 590. And Air Force's top shooter was Lauren Hurley with an aggregate of 1188. For UTEP, their small bore team was Roxanne Keel with a 567. They had a pair of 565s from both Paige Hildebrandt and Isabella Rios. And to round it out was Mika Hames with a 562. And an air rifle, Mika Hames topped it with a 588. Roxanne Keel came in with a 585. You have Paige Hildebrandt with a 583. And rounding it out with Isabella Rios with a 578. And UTEP's top shooter was Roxanne Keel with an aggregate of 1179. The next match was at the Citadel. You had three teams competing at that match. You had the Citadel mixed team, had Wolford, and then Citadel women's team. The Citadel mixed team had an aggregate of 4566. They had a small bore score of a 2257 and an air rifle 2309. And second was Wolford with an aggregate of 2389, small bore of 2136, and an air rifle of 2253. Then the Citadel women's team came in with an aggregate 4365, small bore score of 2111, and an air rifle score of 2254. The scoring teams for the Citadel mixed team. For small bore, you had James Hart IV with a 578, Carson Wood with a 569, Charlotte Welsh with a 565, and Daniel Shapiro with a 545. For air rifle, James Hart IV had a 592, Charlotte Welsh with a 587, Carson Wood with a 569, then Daniel Shapiro with a 561. Top shooter for the Citadel mixed team was James Hart IV with an aggregate 1170. For Wolford, the small bore scoring team was Ainsley Brooke Springer with a 569, Garrett Dahl with a 551, Jesse Delgado with a 512, and Charlie Yang with a 504. And an air rifle, Garrett Dahl came in with a 575, Ainsley Brooke Springer came in with a 572, Charlie Yang with a 565, and Chanson Bullard with a 541. And Wolford's top shooter was Ainsley Brooke Springer with an aggregate of 1141. Then the Citadel women's team, for small bore, Megan Mix with a 535, Riley Needers with a 531, Deanna Douglas with a 530, and Emma Goldman with a 515. In air rifle, Megan Mix had a 587, Riley Needers had a 565, Deanna Douglas came in with a 551, as well as Emma Goldman with a 551. And the Citadel women's top shooter was Megan Mix with an 1122. Another match for that day was another match at Murray State, was Morehead State versus Murray State. Morehead topped that match with a 46-62. They had a 23-02 in small bore and a 23-60 in air. Murray State came in with a 46-38 with a 22-93 small bore and a 23-45 air. The scoring teams for Morehead State in small bore, Bryce Ward had a 578, had a pair of 577s from Adriana Beard and Grace Weber, and Cassidy Wilson came in with a 570. And in air rifle, Grace Weber had a 592, Cassidy Wilson with a 591, Bryce Ward with a 590, and Adriana Beard rounded it out with a 587. And Morehead State's top shooter was Grace Weber with an aggregate 1169. For Murray State, their small bore team was Zach Jackson with a 578, Caroline Martin with a 574, Grace Foley with a 572, and Noelle Meals with a 569. And in air, Caroline Martin had a 592, Grace Foley with a 587, Emma Lawrence with a 581, and Zach Jackson with a 580. Emma Lawrence with a 585, and Zach Jackson with a 581. And their top shooter was Caroline Martin with an 1166. Also that day, we have Wolford competing against North Georgia. North Georgia topped that match out with a 46-30. They had a 22-74 small bore, 23-56 air. Wolford had a 44-02 aggregate with a 21-67 small bore and a 22-35 air. The scoring teams for North Georgia, small bore team was Alyssa Walter with a 587, Maya Cameron with a 578, Madison Kennedy with a 560, and Courtney Allison with a 549. In air rifle, you had Alyssa Walter with a 597, Maya Cameron with a 591, Courtney Allison with a 585, and Alyssa Yancey with a 583. North Georgia's top shooter was Alyssa Walter with an 1184. For Wolford, their small bore team was Ainsley Brooke Springer with a 555, Garrett Dahl with a 540. Also with a 540 was Charlie Yang, and rounding it out was Jesse Delgado with a 532. In an air rifle, you had Ainsley Brooke Springer with a 573, Garrett Dahl with a 565, Charlie Yang with a 556, and Jesse Delgado with a 541. Their top shooter was Ansley Brooks Springer with an 1128. Also on Sunday, we had Morehead State competing against UT Martin. Morehead State topped that match with a 46-67. They had a 23-12 small bore, 23-55 air. UT Martin came in with a 46-20 aggregate with a 22-91 small bore, 23-29 air. The scoring teams for Morehead State in small bore, Adriana Beard with a 582, Cassidy Wilson with a 580, Grace Weber came in with a 576, and Bryce Ward with a 574. And an air rifle, Grace Weber with a 592, Adriana Beard with a 590, Cassidy Wilson with a 589, and Andrew Morris came in with a 584. The top shooter for Morehead State was a tie between Adriana Beard and Marina Koenig with an 1172 combined. Then in UT Martin, the small bore team was Elena Walther with a 579, Nicholas Fairs with a 575, Joseph Kovac with a 574, and Jesse Chamberlain came in with a 563. And in air, Elena Walther with a 586, Nicholas Fairs with a 583, then had a pair of 580s, Jeffrey Basara and Joseph Kovac both came in 580. And the top shooter for UT Martin was Elena Walther with an aggregate of an 1165. And the final match of the weekend was Georgia Southern against TCU. TCU topped that match with a 47-39. They got a 23-50 small bore and 23-89 air. Georgia Southern had a 47-02 with a 23-26 small bore, 23-76 air. The scoring teams for TCU small bore was Katie Zahn with a 592, Stephanie Grunso with a 591, Jean Haverhill with a 585, and Stephanie Allen with a 582. Air rifle, you had Ann White with a 599. Then had a pair of 598s between Katie Zahn and Stephanie Grunso. And then rounding it out was Stephanie Allen with a 594. And the top shooter for TCU was Katie Zahn with an 1190. And with Georgia Southern, the small bore team was Addie Burrow with a 587, Emma Pullman with a 582, Zahara Gonzalez Mezo with a 581, and Amy Visconti with a 576. And for air, Ella Goldfaden had a 597, Addie Burrow with a 594, Zahara Gonzalez Mezo with a 593, and Emma Pullman with a 592. The top shooter for Georgia Southern was Addie Burrow with a combined aggregate of an 1181. So that was the 11 matches that we saw last weekend. And this weekend is going to be another busy weekend. Got a couple teams that are really putting the work in this weekend. As this episode is dropping at midnight on Thursday, the Buckeyes of Ohio are actually en route to Alaska to compete against Alaska Fairbanks. On Friday, they shoot between Alaska and Ohio, and then on Saturday they do it again at Alaska Fairbanks. The Friday match is actually at a gun range, outside gun range outside of Fairbanks, and then on Saturday they shoot at Fairbanks at the school. Then also on Saturday, you've got Woolford against Alabama Birmingham, North Georgia against VMI, the Citadel against Georgia Southern, Ole Miss against West Virginia, Kentucky against Morehead State, Memphis against Jackson State, Akron against Navy, Army against MIT, and then on Sunday, West Virginia on the way home is stopping at Memphis to compete against them, and then Air Force against Nebraska. So it's going to be another busy weekend. So everybody get ready to watch some dots over the weekend. Most of these matches are on Megalink with live targets. If you go to mllive.com, you're able to look at the matches and watch them live. So that's going to be it for this week in NCAA Rifle. I got a few news items that you may be interested in, so we'll go over that real quick here. Some open matches that are coming up that you may be interested in. Morehead State is hosting the Eagle Open. That's going to be from November 17th to the 19th. It's a combined 3-piece small bore match and 60-shot international competition. Then in January, Palmyra Rifle Invitational is being held. It's the 25th annual one. It's up in Pennsylvania. That is pretty much every weekend in January. That's a 3P small bore and 60-shot international competition. And then also in December, the USA Shooting Winter Air Gun Championship is being held. That's actually going to be at 2 locations simultaneously. It's going to be at the Olympic Training Center in Colorado Springs and at Camp Perry in Ohio. So, and you can go to the events page at usashooting.com to register for that. Then for any junior that is junior shooter that is graduating in 2024, the CMP scholarship program is open now. And this year, they're not only doing one $5,000 scholarship, but they're actually doing 4. And that's renewable for 4 years. So that gives you a total of $20,000 over the course of the 4 years if you're eligible. So you can go to the CMP website to register for that. And then they're also giving away or doing the $1,000 scholarships along with the $5,000 ones. So if you go to our show notes at centertens.com for all the link, or you can find all the links for all the scorecards for the past week's matches, along with the information on what we discussed with the news, links to contacting Morehead State, Palmyra, and everything like that to do registration. So that'll be it for this week. And as we say every weekend, the most important shot is always the one that's in front of you. Thank you for listening to Season 1 of Center Tens. If you like the show, please leave a 5-star rating on Apple Podcasts and Spotify. This helps out tremendously. Give us a follow on Instagram and Facebook at Center Tens. Center Tens can be found on Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, iHeartRadio, Spotify, Buzzsprout, Pocket Cast, and at centertens.com. Hope you join us for our next episode.